Welcome once again, dear friends, that join our audiobook family. Subscribe for more. Today we will hear a story that exposes the veil of greed. The Dark Caves. Elliot and Marissa's relationship had a unique charm, rooted in shared vulnerabilities and an almost accidental sense of belonging. For Marissa, Elliot Kane was a breath of fresh air, a stark contrast to the tumultuous chaos of her past with Victor Hayes, now a shadow of memory locked away for violent crimes. Yet, the scars of that relationship lingered, making Marissa's affection for Elliot feel at times like a desperate grasp for stability. Elliot, on the other hand, was baffled by her attention. His life had been unremarkable of late, a quiet struggle with financial constraints and the echoes of a once vivid career. That she, of all people, would choose him seemed improbable. And yet, here she was, professing a kind of love that Elliot barely knew how to reciprocate. "I don't get it," Elliot muttered one evening, their quiet dinner punctuated by the soft clink of cutlery against plates. He glanced up at her from across the table, his brows furrowed in a mix of confusion and wonder. "Why me?" Marissa set her fork down, leaning forward with an intensity that made Elliot shift in his seat. "Why not you?" she countered, her voice calm but resolute. "You're good to me? You listen. You don't try to control me or scare me. That's more than I can say for anyone else I've trusted." "Yeah, but I'm not exactly a catch." He gestured vaguely, his words fumbling. "I mean, look at me. I'm scraping by, Marissa. My glory days are, well, they weren't even that glorious, let's be honest." Marissa tilted her head, her lips curling into a soft smile. "Glory's overrated," she said, reaching across the table to take his hand. Her fingers were warm, her grip firm enough to anchor him in the moment. "You're honest. You're real. That's what matters to me." The sincerity in her voice made something stir in Elliot's chest, an unfamiliar warmth he wasn't entirely sure he deserved. He squeezed her hand gently, unable to find the words to match hers, and so he simply nodded, hoping she understood. Marissa had a way of drawing him out of his self-imposed shell, often by sheer curiosity. She was particularly fascinated by his past, a chapter of his life he had tucked away like an old photograph, faded and gathering dust. Elliot had spent years traveling with a circus, a life of daring stunts and endless motion that seemed almost unreal in the context of his current, quieter existence. He had been a trapeze artist, a stunt double in small-time films, a man unafraid to leap into danger for the thrill of it. Or so it had seemed at the time. One evening, as they sat on the worn couch in Elliot's modest living room, Marissa turned to him with a playful glint in her eyes. "So," she began, drawing out the word, "when are you going to show me some of these legendary circus tricks?" Elliot chuckled, shaking his head. "Legendary? Hardly. And I'm a little out of practice, in case you hadn't noticed." "Oh, come on," she teased, nudging him with her elbow. "You can't just tell me you were this amazing trapeze artist, and then leave it at that. I want proof." "I never said amazing," Elliot corrected, though there was a hint of pride in his voice. "And I'm pretty sure I'd break something if I tried now." Marissa laughed, the sound light and infectious. "You're no fun," she said, though her smile suggested otherwise. "Seriously, though, it must have been incredible. Tell me more about it. What was it like, flying through the air like that?" Elliot leaned back, a wistful look crossing his face as he let the memories resurface. "It was freeing," he admitted. "Scary as hell, too, but in the best way. There's this moment, right when you let go of the bar when you're suspended midair, and it feels like time just stops. It's like nothing else matters except that moment." Marissa listened intently, her eyes fixed on him. "That sounds amazing," she said softly. "Do you miss it?" "Sometimes," he admitted. "But it's a young man's game. You've got to be fearless, and I guess I'm not that guy anymore." "I don't buy that," Marissa said, her tone firm. "You're still that guy. You just need a little reminding." Her confidence in him was both endearing and unnerving, and Elliot found himself smiling despite his reservations. "Maybe," he said, though the thought lingered in his mind long after the conversation had drifted to other topics. Marissa's fascination with his circus days wasn't just idle curiosity. It was a window into the way she saw him, not as the tired, financially struggling man he often felt like, but as someone capable of extraordinary things. And slowly, in her company, Elliot began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she was right. The night Marissa revealed her secret to Elliot started like any other. They were sitting in his cramped living room, the dim glow of a floor lamp casting long shadows on the walls. Elliot was halfway through a story about a particularly disastrous circus performance when Marissa interrupted him with an uncharacteristic seriousness in her tone. "Elliot," she said, leaning forward on the couch, her elbows resting on her knees, "I need to tell you something, and you have to promise you won't freak out." Elliot froze mid-sentence, his brow furrowing as he turned to her. "Okay, that's not ominous at all. I'm serious," she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. "This is big." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "All right, hit me. What's so big it's got you all worked up?" She hesitated for a moment, her eyes darting to the window, as if expecting someone to be watching. Then she took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. Victor had a stash. $500,000. Elliot blinked, unsure he'd heard her correctly. "Come again?" "From a bank robbery," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Before he got arrested. He told me about it once. Said he hid the money in a cave somewhere remote. It's still there. No one else knows about it." Elliot stared at her, his mind racing. "Wait a minute," he said, holding up a hand. "Are you telling me Victor, your ex, the guy who's in jail for being, a violent psychopath, robbed a bank and stashed $500,000 in a cave, and you've just been sitting on this information?" Marissa flinched at the edge in his voice, but held her ground. "I didn't know what to do with it, Elliot. I couldn't exactly march into a police station and tell them. And it's not like I wanted anything to do with Victor's legacy." Elliot shook his head, running a hand through his hair. "This is insane. Absolutely insane. Why are you telling me this now?" "Because I trust you," she said simply, her gaze unwavering. "And because I need your help." "My help? With what exactly?" He could already feel the knot of anxiety tightening in his chest, but he had a sinking suspicion he knew where this was going. Marissa leaned closer, lowering her voice even further. "To get the money. It's just sitting there, Elliot. No one knows about it, and Victor's not getting out of prison anytime soon. We could take it. Start over." Elliot laughed, though there was no humor in it. "Start over? With stolen money? Marissa, do you even hear yourself? It's not like we're stealing it from anyone," she argued, her tone defensive. "The bank's insurance would have covered the loss years ago. This money is just abandoned. It's not hurting anyone sitting there, and it could change everything for us," Elliot repeated, his voice rising slightly. "Marissa, I'm barely keeping my life together as it is. The last thing I need is to get tangled up in something like this." Marissa's expression softened, and she reached out to place a hand on his arm. "I know it sounds crazy," she said gently, "but think about it. You've been struggling for so long, Elliot. You could have a fresh start. We both could." He pulled his arm away, standing up and pacing the room. "You're asking me to risk everything for a bag of stolen cash. What if someone finds out? What if the cops get wind of it? I don't know about you, but I'd rather not end up sharing a cell with Victor." "No one will find out," she insisted. "I've thought this through. The cave is in the middle of nowhere. We go in, grab the money, and disappear. Simple." Elliot stopped pacing, turning to face her with a mix of disbelief and frustration. "Simple? Nothing about this is simple, Marissa. It's dangerous, and it's illegal, and it's our chance," she interrupted, her voice firm. "Don't you see that? This could be the break we've both been waiting for." He stared at her, torn between the weight of her words and the voice in his head screaming that this was a terrible idea. The desperation in her eyes was impossible to ignore, and a small part of him couldn't help but wonder. What if she was right? What if this really was their chance? Finally, he sighed, running a hand down his face. "This is insane," he muttered. "Maybe," Marissa said, a hopeful smile tugging at her lips. "But will you think about it? Please." Elliot exhaled slowly, his mind a whirlwind of doubts and possibilities. "I'll think about it," he said at last, though the words felt like a slippery slope. Marissa's smile widened, and for the first time that night, there was a flicker of relief in her eyes. "That's all I'm asking," she said softly. But even as she spoke, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that thinking about it was already the first step down a very dangerous road. The decision to go after Victor's hidden loot wasn't made lightly, but once it was, there was no turning back. Elliot and Marissa set out in the dead of night, their plans shrouded in equal parts secrecy and tension. The old sedan they drove wheezed its way along the winding roads of West Virginia until they reached a desolate clearing where the trees loomed tall and menacing under the moonlight. "This is as far as the car goes," Elliot said, turning off the engine. He sat in silence for a moment, gripping the steering wheel tightly, as if still trying to convince himself this wasn't the most reckless decision of his life. Marissa, seated next to him with a backpack at her feet, glanced his way. "You're sure about this?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew his answer. "No," he admitted, his lips twitching into a humorless smile. "But here we are." She nodded, pulling the bag onto her lap and unzipping it to reveal its contents: a flashlight, a map, a first aid kit, and, tucked at the bottom, a rifle she'd borrowed from a friend who didn't ask too many questions. She held it up, its weight unfamiliar in her hands. "You know how to use one of these, right?" Elliot raised an eyebrow. "I was a stuntman, Marissa. Not Rambo." "Well, figure it out fast," she quipped, tossing the rifle into his lap before climbing out of the car. "We're going to need it." The air was crisp and biting as they began their trek into the forest, the only sound the crunch of leaves beneath their boots. The map Marissa carried was old and hand-drawn, its lines faint and unreliable. But she seemed confident, navigating the dense undergrowth with an almost unnerving determination. "You've been here before?" Elliot asked, breaking the silence. "Once," she replied without looking back. "Victor brought me when he was hiding the money. Told me it was the safest place he could think of. No one would stumble on it by accident. And no one would hear us scream if things go south," Elliot muttered under his breath. Marissa smirked. "You're such an optimist." As they pressed on, the terrain grew steeper and more challenging. Elliot stumbled on a loose rock, cursing as he regained his balance. "This better be worth it," he grumbled. "If we get there and it's just an empty cave, I'm going to—" "Sure," Marissa hissed, holding up a hand to stop him. She crouched low, peering into the darkness ahead. "Did you hear that?" Elliot froze, straining to hear over the pounding of his own heart. A rustling sound came from the bushes to their left, faint but unmistakable. He gripped the rifle awkwardly, his palms slick with sweat. "What is it?" "Probably just an animal," she whispered, though the tension in her voice betrayed her nerves. "Keep moving." They hurried on, their pace quickening as the forest closed in around them. The moonlight barely penetrated the canopy above, and Elliot found himself relying more and more on Marissa's flashlight to guide his steps. By the time they reached the base of the rocky hill where the cave was hidden, his legs were burning, and his patience was wearing thin. "This is it," Marissa said, her voice tinged with relief as she pointed to a jagged opening in the rock face. The cave entrance was small, almost unnoticeable unless you were looking for it, and half concealed by a tangle of vines. Elliot stared at it, his breath visible in the cold dawn air. "We hiked through all that for this?" "Come on," she said, brushing past him and ducking into the narrow entrance. "You'll change your tune when you see what's inside." He sighed, slinging the rifle over his shoulder and following her into the cave. The air inside was cool and damp, the walls slick with condensation. Marissa's flashlight cast eerie shadows as they ventured deeper, the beam revealing jagged stalactites hanging above them like the teeth of some ancient beast. "Do you even remember where he hid it?" Elliot asked, his voice echoing in the confined space. "Not exactly," Marissa admitted, pausing to examine the map. "But it's here." "I know it is." Elliot rolled his eyes. "Great. We're on a scavenger hunt in a creepy cave. What could possibly go wrong?" Marissa ignored him, pressing forward with an intensity that bordered on obsession. They climbed over boulders and waded through shallow pools of water, their progress slow but steady. Finally, just as the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the cracks in the cave walls, Marissa let out a triumphant cry. "Here! It's here!" she exclaimed, dropping to her knees in front of a small crevice in the rock. She reached inside, her fingers brushing against something solid and metallic. With a grunt, she pulled out a battered metal box, its surface rusted but intact. Elliot crouched beside her, staring at the box, as if it might explode. "That's it? That's the stash." Marissa grinned, her eyes shining with a mix of triumph and relief. "This is it?" Elliot exhaled, the weight of their journey finally hitting him. "Let's hope it was worth the trip," he said, though he couldn't deny the flicker of excitement creeping into his voice. Marissa glanced at him, her smile widening. Only one way to find out. The cavern's interior loomed wide and foreboding, with jagged walls and a ceiling that disappeared into darkness. Elliot shone the flashlight upwards, its narrow beam illuminating the target, a dusty suitcase precariously perched atop a high, protruding rock ledge. The suitcase seemed almost absurdly out of place, a reminder of Victor's cunning in choosing such an inaccessible hiding spot. Marissa tilted her head, squinting up at the ledge. "That's it," she said with certainty. "I told you he'd make it hard to get to." "Hard?" Elliot scoffed, lowering the flashlight. "This is insane. Did he expect to sprout wings and fly up there?" Marissa smirked, slinging her backpack to the ground. "He wasn't planning on coming back for it. That's why it's still here." Elliot sighed, running a hand through his hair as he studied the climb. The rock face was jagged but uneven, dotted with ledges and protrusions that could double as footholds. Still, the height was dizzying, and the thought of falling onto the unforgiving cave floor wasn't exactly inviting. "You've done crazier things, haven't you?" Marissa teased, nudging him playfully. "Come on, Mr. Circus Performer. You've got this." He shot her a sideways glance. "Yeah, but back then I had safety nets. And a paycheck." "Think of the loot as your paycheck," she said, her tone light but her eyes betraying a flicker of unease. "Or, do you want me to climb up there?" Elliot raised a hand. "Oh no. Last thing I need is for you to get stuck halfway up. You'd never let me hear the end of it." She grinned. "Exactly." With a resigned sigh, Elliot shrugged off his jacket and handed it to her. He stretched his arms, testing his joints. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than her. "Let's see if the old skills are still in there somewhere." He approached the rock face, gripping the first handhold and testing its stability. It was damp and cold, but it held. As he began his ascent, each movement was deliberate, his body remembering techniques he hadn't used in years. He hooked his foot into a crevice, then reached for the next protrusion, slowly making his way upward. "You're doing great," Marissa called out, craning her neck to watch him. "Still got the moves, huh?" "Don't distract me," he shot back, his voice strained as he hauled himself up to the next ledge. "And for the record, I'm adding a danger fee to my cut of this treasure." She laughed. "Fair enough." About halfway up, Elliot paused on a narrow ledge to catch his breath. The height was starting to get to him, and the flashlight in Marissa's hand looked like a distant star. He glanced up at the suitcase, still maddeningly out of reach. "You okay?" Marissa asked, her voice echoing in the cavern. "Peachy," he replied, though his sweaty palms told a different story. "Remind me again why I'm risking my neck for this." "Because I'd never forgive you if you didn't." He chuckled despite himself. Good answer. The next stretch was the hardest. The rock face became steeper, the footholds smaller and more slippery. At one point, his foot slipped, sending a shower of pebbles cascading to the ground. Marissa gasped, her flashlight beam wobbling. "Elliot," she called out, panic creeping into her voice. "I'm fine," he said quickly, pressing himself against the rock to steady his nerves. "Just don't shine that light in my eyes." "You better be fine," she muttered, "because I am not dragging you out of here." With renewed determination, he pressed on. The suitcase was tantalizingly close now, just a few more feet. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the ledge. Shifting his weight carefully, he managed to pull himself up and crawl onto the platform. The suitcase sat there, covered in a thin layer of dust, its handle frayed but intact. "Got it," he called down, his voice filled with relief. Marissa clapped her hands together. "You're a superhero." Yeah, he muttered, examining the suitcase. It was heavier than he expected, its latches rusted shut. He slung it over his shoulder, taking a moment to steady himself before starting the descent. Coming down was trickier than going up. The weight of the suitcase threw off his balance, and his muscles screamed in protest. But inch by inch, he made his way back down, finally dropping onto the cave floor with a thud. Marissa rushed over, beaming. "You did it." Elliot handed her the suitcase, his breath ragged. "Next time," he said between gasps, "we're hiring a crane." She laughed, but her attention was already on the suitcase, her fingers tracing its surface. "Let's open it." "Not here," he said firmly, taking a swig from his water bottle. "Let's get out of this cave first. I've had enough danger for one day." Marissa nodded, clutching the suitcase tightly. "Fair point. Let's go." As they made their way back toward the cave entrance, Elliot glanced over his shoulder at the ledge he'd just conquered. He couldn't help but feel a small sense of pride and a nagging curiosity about what they'd find inside the suitcase. The air in the cave was thick with the smell of damp earth as Elliot lowered the suitcase to Marissa's waiting hands. A cloud of dust puffed up when she set it down on the cave floor, her eyes shining with triumph. She ran her hands over the weathered leather, the latches creaking slightly under her touch. "We did it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking louder would wake some dormant danger in the shadows. "Victor's treasure, it's real." Elliot climbed down the last few feet, his boots crunching on loose gravel as he landed next to her. He wiped his dusty hands on his jeans and leaned against the rock wall, catching his breath. "Yeah," he said, studying her with a cautious smile. "Real enough to get us killed if we're not careful." Marissa's laugh was light, almost disbelieving, as she opened the suitcase. Inside, neatly bundled stacks of cash glinted under the flashlight's beam, their faded edges telling a story of long years hidden away. For a moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint drip of water somewhere deeper in the cave. $500,000, Marissa breathed, her fingers grazing the bundles. "Just sitting here all this time?" "Not anymore," Elliot said, his tone tinged with irony. "Now it's sitting in our hands. And you know what that means." Marissa looked up, her brows furrowing. "What?" "That we got a target on our backs," Elliot replied. He scanned the cavern as if expecting Victor's ghost, or something worse, to emerge from the shadows. "Money like this doesn't come without strings. People will be looking for it. Maybe even Victor's old crew." Marissa frowned, but quickly dismissed his concern with a wave of her hand. "Victor's crew is scattered, Elliot. They wouldn't even know where to start looking." "Maybe," he said, his gaze lingering on her. "But you seem awfully confident for someone who just stumbled across a fortune in a cave. Makes me wonder." She stiffened slightly, her eyes narrowing. "Wonder what?" Elliot shrugged, his tone casual but his words sharp. "Wonder how much of this was luck and how much was planned." Marissa stood, the suitcase still clutched tightly in her hands. "You think I'm playing you?" she asked, her voice steady but her expression tight. I think, he said slowly, stepping closer, that I've been around enough people in my life to know when something doesn't add up. For a moment, their eyes locked, the air between them charged with unspoken tension. Then Marissa broke the spell, shaking her head with a frustrated laugh. You're paranoid, Elliot. All those years dodging danger in the circus must have fried your nerves. Maybe, he said, forcing a grin. Or maybe it's kept me alive. Marissa rolled her eyes and turned away, fiddling with the suitcase. Look, I get it. This is a lot of money, and it's a big deal. But we're in this together, okay? Trust me. He didn't answer immediately, watching as she bent over to adjust the rifle strapped to her backpack. Her words sounded convincing, but something in her body language felt off. Trust her? Maybe. But trust the situation? Not a chance. Elliot's eyes flicked to the rifle. It was an older model, a little worn but functional, and it had been their only defense on this trek. If Marissa had a change of heart, or decided she didn't want to split the money, it wouldn't take much for her to turn that weapon on him. As she busied herself with the suitcase, Elliot moved casually, his hand brushing against the rifle. With practiced ease, he worked the mechanism, slipping out the bullets one by one. They were cold in his hand, metallic reminders of the fine line between survival and betrayal. He pocketed them quickly, his heart pounding, and slung the rifle back into place before she noticed. Ready to head out? Marissa asked, turning back to him. Her smile was back, warm and familiar, as if the moment of tension had never happened. Elliot nodded, forcing a smile of his own. Yeah, he said, lifting the flashlight and gesturing toward the cave entrance. Let's get out of here before the bats start charging us rent. She laughed, the sound echoing through the cavern as they started toward the exit. Elliot followed close behind, his mind racing. Was she planning something, or was he overthinking? Either way, he wasn't about to let his guard down. Not with that much money in play, and not with someone like Marissa holding the cards. The morning sun filtered through the trees as they emerged from the cave, the suitcase heavy in Elliot's grip. The weight wasn't just physical. It carried an unspoken tension between him and Marissa. They hadn't spoken much since leaving the cavern, each lost in their thoughts. Elliot kept his eyes on the trail, his muscles taut, ready for whatever might come next. Marissa's voice cut through the stillness like a knife. You've been quiet, she said, her tone light but probing. Cat got your tongue, Elliot? He glanced back at her, the corners of his mouth tugging into a wry smile. Just thinking. Big score like this comes with complications. Complications, she repeated, a strange edge in her voice. That's one way to put it. Elliot paused, sensing the shift in her tone. But before he could say anything more, Marissa stopped abruptly. He turned to face her, and that's when he saw it. The rifle, now raised and pointed directly at his chest. His heart dropped. Marissa, he said slowly, raising his hands in a placating gesture. What are you doing? Her lips curled into a cold, mocking smile. What I should have done the moment you agreed to help me. You didn't really think this was your payday, did you? Elliot's jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay calm. We had a deal. A deal? She laughed, the sound sharp and cruel. Elliot, you're such a romantic. Always trying to see the best in people. That's what made you so easy to use. Her words hit him harder than the rifle ever could. He had been wary, yes, but a part of him had still wanted to believe in her, in the bond they'd formed over the past few days. So this was all an act, he asked, his voice tinged with both hurt and disbelief. All that talk about Victor, about wanting to leave your past behind. Marissa's expression hardened. Victor always said you were naive. I didn't believe him at first, but look at you, standing there like a lost puppy. Of course, it was an act. You think I needed you? The only thing you were good for was climbing that rock. Elliot's mind raced as he stared down the barrel of the rifle. His pulse thundered in his ears, but he kept his voice steady. And what happens now? You take the money and walk away? What about Victor? He's not exactly the forgiving type. Her smile faltered for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it. That's my problem, not yours. The point is you're out of the picture. Marissa's finger hovered over the trigger. Elliot's breath hitched, but he forced himself to stay composed. You don't have to do this, he said, his voice low and even. We can split it, get out of this mess together. She shook her head, a flicker of regret crossing her face before the cold resolve returned. Sorry, Elliot. This is the end of the line for you. Marissa pulled the trigger. Click. Her eyes widened in confusion, and she instinctively looked down at the rifle. She pulled the trigger again, harder this time. Click. Elliot allowed himself a grim smile. Problem, Marissa? Her head snapped up, her face a mix of shock and anger. What did you? Removed the bullets, he said simply, his voice almost casual. Guess all those circus tricks weren't the only thing I learned over the years. Marissa's grip on the rifle tightened, but now her confidence was crumbling. She took a step back, her eyes darting between Elliot and the suitcase. How could you? Because I knew this was coming. Elliot cut her off, his voice hardening. You think I didn't see through you? That little story about Victor, the cave, the money, it all added up. But you know what? I wanted to believe you. I wanted to think there was something real between us. Marissa's face twisted into a sneer. Spare me the lecture. You think you're any better? You're just a washed-up acrobat chasing a payday. Maybe, he said, stepping closer. But at least I don't stab people in the back. Before she could react, Elliot lunged, grabbing the rifle and twisting it out of her hands. She struggled, clawing at his arm, but he was stronger and angrier. With a sharp jerk, he tossed the weapon to the ground and shoved her back. Marissa stumbled, her eyes blazing with fury. What now? She spat. You gonna kill me? Prove you're just like Victor. Elliot stared at her, his chest heaving. For a long moment he didn't say anything. Then he shook his head. No, Marissa. I'm not like Victor. But I'm not sticking around to find out who else you've been lying to. He picked up the suitcase, slinging it over his shoulder, and started walking. Behind him, Marissa shouted after him, her voice laced with desperation and anger. You think you can just walk away with that money? You won't make it out of these woods alive. Elliot didn't look back. Her words echoed in his ears, but he kept moving, his grip on the suitcase tightening. Betrayed, yes, but he wasn't beaten. Not yet. Elliot steadied himself on the narrow ledge, the suitcase still in his grasp. The rock beneath his boots felt as precarious as the trust he had once placed in Marissa. Below, she stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of fury and twisted amusement. Her voice rang out, sharp and cutting against the cavern's walls. You think you're so clever, don't you, Elliot? She sneered, her gaze like a dagger. You've got the money, but what's your plan now? Jump down with it? Or maybe you're hoping I'll catch you? She let out a laugh, cold and mirthless. Face it, Kane. You're stuck. Elliot glanced around, the reality of his predicament sinking in. The suitcase was heavier than he anticipated, and the climb down would be infinitely harder than the ascent. Sweat dripped down his brow, but he kept his composure, refusing to give her the satisfaction of seeing him rattle. You really think a little height is going to scare me? He shot back, his voice echoing through the chamber. I've spent half my life walking tightropes. He gestured to the ledge. This is a walk in the park. Marissa smirked and pointed to something just behind him. Oh, really? Then maybe you'd like to meet the last guy who thought so. Elliot frowned and turned his head, his stomach twisting as he spotted it. A skeleton, sprawled just a few feet away on a lower ledge. The remains were tangled in tattered clothing, its bony hand still outstretched toward the rock face, as if in a desperate attempt to climb back up. The skull was tilted toward him, its hollow eye sockets staring with a macabre emptiness. That, Marissa said, her tone dripping with satisfaction, is what's left of Victor's first partner. Poor guy. He was smart enough to stash the money, but not smart enough to get back down. Died up there all alone. No food, no water. Just him and his regrets. Elliot's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him unnerved. Victor used to tell me about him, she continued, circling the base of the rock like a predator toying with its prey. He said the guy begged for help, cried like a baby when Victor refused to throw him a rope. But, hey, that's what happens when you don't think things through. You must have really loved Victor, Elliot said dryly, forcing a smirk. Sounds like a stand-up guy. Marissa narrowed her eyes. Don't you dare judge me, Elliot. You don't know what it's like to survive in his world. Survive? Elliot shot back. Looks more like you're thriving on betrayal. Her lips curled into a snarl. You think you're better than me? You're just another lowlife trying to cash in. The only difference is, you're too stupid to see when the odds aren't in your favor. Elliot shifted his weight carefully, his mind racing. The skeleton wasn't just a grim warning. It was a reminder of what Victor, and by extension, Marissa were capable of. He couldn't afford to let his guard down. Is this the part where you tell me I'm going to end up like him? Elliot asked, nodding toward the remains. Marissa grinned. If the shoe fits. You might have outsmarted me with the rifle, but look where it's gotten you. One wrong step, one moment of weakness, and you'll join him. Or, she added, her voice taking on a false sweetness, you could just hand the money over. Maybe I'll be nice and throw you a rope. Elliot laughed, the sound defiant and full of bite. Nice try, Marissa. But I'd rather take my chances up here than trust you again. Her smile faltered, replaced by a glimmer of frustration. Suit yourself, she said, stepping back. But don't say I didn't warn you. You're not as invincible as you think, circus boy. Elliot turned his attention to the climb ahead, forcing himself to block out her taunts. The skeleton was a stark reminder of the risks, but he wasn't about to let fear, or Marissa, dictate his fate. Tightening his grip on the suitcase, he took a deep breath and began to plan his descent. Behind him, Marissa's voice rang out one last time, her tone venomous. You won't make it, Elliot. You'll die up there just like he did. And when you do, I'll be the one laughing. Elliot didn't look back. We'll see about that, he muttered under his breath, his focus unshakable. Whatever lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to end up another skeleton in Victor and Marissa's story. Marissa barely took a few steps toward the mouth of the cave, the suitcase gripped tightly in her hands, when Elliot made his move. From his perch on the ledge, he unraveled a length of rope from his pack, a relic of his circus days he'd brought along just in case. His muscles tensed, the years of practice and precision coming back to him in an instant. You're not walking out of here with that money, Elliot called out, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. Marissa froze mid-step, glancing over her shoulder. You're in no position to stop me, she scoffed, lifting the suitcase higher as if to taunt him. Face it, Elliot, you've already lost. You're forgetting something, Elliot said, looping the rope in his hands with expert speed. I used to make my living defying gravity. Before Marissa could respond, the rope shot through the air, the noose tightening cleanly around her upper body. She gasped as the rough fibers bit into her arms, pinning them to her sides. The suitcase slipped from her hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud. What the? She shrieked, struggling against the rope. Let me go, you idiot. Not until we've had a proper chat, Elliot said, his voice tinged with grim satisfaction. He planted his feet firmly and yanked on the rope, using a nearby rock as leverage. Marissa was lifted off the ground with a sharp cry, her feet kicking wildly. You crazy bastard, she yelled, writhing in midair. Put me down right now. Elliot's face was set, his grip on the rope unyielding. Oh, now you want me to help you? Funny how that works. What happened to leaving me to die up here like your last victim? That's not the same, she protested, twisting her body in a futile attempt to free herself. You don't have to do this, Elliot. We can still work together. He let out a short laugh, his eyes narrowing. Work together? That's rich coming from someone who just tried to kill me. How do I know you won't stab me in the back the second your feet hit the ground? I swear I won't, she pleaded, her tone shifting from anger to desperation. This was all a misunderstanding. I was scared, that's all. Elliot's jaw clenched. You must think I'm as gullible as you were convincing. But here's the thing, Marissa. I'm done playing your game. He tugged the rope again, sending her swinging slightly. She screamed, her voice echoing off the cave walls. The sight might have been comical if the stakes weren't so deadly. Beneath her, the suitcase lay temptingly close, but Elliot made no move to retrieve it just yet. Marissa's voice grew frantic. You don't understand, Elliot. Victor's going to come for that money. And if he finds out you took it, you're dead. We need each other to survive. Elliot shook his head. You said it yourself, Marissa. You're good at lying. Why should I believe anything you say now? She fell silent, her face a mask of frustration and fear. For the first time, Elliot felt like he had the upper hand, and he wasn't about to let it go. You're going to stay right there, he said, his tone firm, until I figure out what to do with you. Maybe I'll leave you like Victor left his partner. Or maybe I'll take the money and let fate decide. You wouldn't, she hissed, her voice trembling. You're not like him. Elliot leaned over the ledge, his eyes meeting hers. No, I'm not. But you've given me plenty of reasons to reconsider. The tension between them was palpable, the air in the cave thick with unspoken threats and unrelenting resolve. For the first time, it was Marissa who seemed truly powerless. And for Elliot, that was a start. Marissa dangled helplessly in the air, the rope digging into her arms as she swayed above the rocky cave floor. Her once confident smirk had dissolved into a look of sheer panic. Elliot, please, she shouted, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. You've made your point, okay? Let me down. We can work this out. Elliot stood firm below her, his hands gripping the rope with an iron will. His face was set in a cold, unreadable expression. The years of being underestimated, manipulated, and used seemed to crystallize in this moment. You want mercy, Marissa, he said, his tone low and measured, each word cutting like a blade. Funny, coming from the woman who left me to die not 10 minutes ago. That was a mistake, she cried, twisting in midair. I was scared. I wasn't thinking straight. Victor made me do it. You know how dangerous he is. Save it, Elliot snapped, his eyes flashing with anger. You had every chance to tell me the truth, but you chose to lie. You used me to climb your way out of trouble, and now you expect me to forget all that because you're scared. Marissa's voice grew more frantic, her facade of control shattered. You don't understand. Victor will kill me if I don't bring him the money. Elliot, please. I didn't have a choice. Elliot tilted his head, considering her words with chilling detachment. Choice? You had a choice when you pointed that rifle at me. You had a choice when you left me stranded on that ledge. Don't talk to me about choices, Marissa. You made yours. She was crying now, her tears streaking her face. You're not a killer, Elliot. You're better than this. Please, don't do this to me. Elliot stepped closer, looking her dead in the eyes. You're right, Marissa. I'm not a killer. But that doesn't mean I owe you anything. With a sharp tug, he swung her closer to the ground, enough to make her gasp, but not enough to let her go. Reaching down, he picked up the suitcase. The weight of it felt like more than money. It felt like freedom, like justice, like the end of a chapter he'd been trapped in for far too long. You can stay there and think about your choices, he said coldly, stepping toward the cave's entrance. Or maybe Victor will come looking for you. Either way, you'll get what you deserve. Elliot, she screamed, her voice hoarse with desperation. Don't leave me here. Please. You can't do this. He paused at the mouth of the cave, his silhouette framed by the first rays of morning light. Goodbye, Marissa, he said, his voice steady and resolute. Without another glance, he walked out into the forest, the suitcase in hand, leaving her cries behind him. For the first time in years, Elliot felt like he was in control. The past no longer held him captive, and the money he carried wasn't just a fortune. It was his new beginning. Friends, subscribe to my channel. There are many more interesting stories like this. Do listen to them too, and thank you for listening to this story till here.